They always say that life doesn't give you a heads up before turning everything upside down. I guess I never really thought much of it until the day I came home early. It was a Tuesday afternoon, nothing special about it at first. My boss had canceled a week-long business trip last minute, and instead of dragging my feet around the office all day, I decided to surprise Megan with lunch. She'd always mentioned how she wished I had more time for little things like that. So, I grabbed her favorite sandwiches from the deli downtown, the kind she always ordered when we had our lazy Sundays. I wasn't thinking about anything else, just that look on her face when she'd see me standing there, sandwiches in hand, like I finally got what she meant about small gestures. I pulled into the driveway, noticing the curtains drawn in the living room. Megan usually liked to keep them open, letting the afternoon sun bathe the furniture in light. It was one of her quirks, something about natural light bringing warmth to a home. But I didn't think much of it then. Unlocking the front door, I stepped inside quietly, the smell of lavender air freshener meeting me like always. Shoes neatly by the door, her coat on the rack. Everything seemed normal, even peaceful. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the TV, some low murmur of voices upstairs. But as I stood there, the sound became clearer, and my stomach tightened. Laughter, a man's voice blending with Megan's. I could feel my grip tighten around the paper bag in my hand. My mind raced, searching for some logical explanation. Maybe it was a repairman, someone helping her with the leaky faucet she complained about last week. But the knot forming in my chest wasn't buying it. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, each step sounding louder in my ears. The voices got clearer, her giggle unmistakable, followed by his deeper tone. It wasn't just friendly chatter. It had that kind of familiarity you only share with someone who knows you too well. When I reached the top of the stairs, the door to our bedroom was cracked open, just enough for me to see them. Megan, wrapped in a sheet, hair disheveled, her bare shoulders glistening with sweat. In him, my brother Nick, the man I'd grown up with, the one who'd stood beside me at our wedding. They didn't see me at first, too wrapped up in each other to notice the man standing outside the door, holding sandwiches like a fool. I froze, my brain struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Nick's hand slid across her back, and she leaned into him like it was second nature, like it had been happening for a long time. My throat felt dry, as if someone had reached in and pulled the air right out of me. I didn't know whether to scream, run, or break down. All I could do was stare at the betrayal unfolding right in front of me, the walls of the life I thought I knew crumbling without a sound. Suddenly, Nick shifted, and his eyes met mine. The smile on his face disappeared in an instant, replaced by wide-eyed panic. Megan followed his gaze, and when she saw me, her hand flew to her mouth, like she could somehow take back everything I'd just witnessed. I dropped the bag. The sandwiches hit the floor, and the sound of crinkling paper was the only noise in the hallway. "David," she whispered, her voice cracking like she wasn't sure if she should be afraid or ashamed. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, drowning out the part of me that wanted answers. All I could feel was the weight of the betrayal, suffocating and relentless, wrapping itself around me like a vice. And just like that, I turned around and walked back down the stairs. I don't know how I made it to the front door without collapsing, but I did. As I stepped outside, the cool breeze hit my face, and it was the first time I realized I was sweating. The world outside looked the same. The birds chirped, a car drove past, and the leaves rustled in the trees as if nothing had happened. But inside, everything was different. I got into my car, put my hands on the steering wheel, and stared ahead. I didn't know where to go. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. And that's how it began, the unraveling of the life I thought I had built with someone who was supposed to be my forever. But forever had just shattered like glass, and I was left holding the shards. Something inside me stirred, not sadness, at least not yet, but a wave of confusion and the kind of resentment that quietly simmers before it boils over. My brother and my wife. I drove for what felt like hours, but when I looked at the clock, only 30 minutes had passed. My mind was stuck on a loop, replaying what I'd seen like some cruel film I couldn't turn off. Megan's flushed face, Nick's arms around her, the way they didn't even hear me come in until it was too late. I parked at a small lot near the park, one of those quiet places where nobody would bother you, and just sat there. My hands were still gripping the wheel, my knuckles white as I tried to piece together when it all went wrong. I wasn't sure whether to scream or cry, but neither felt right. Instead, I let the silence consume me, sitting in the car like a statue, as if the world around me had no reason to exist anymore. When did this start? Had I been blind all along? Every smile, every dinner, every holiday gathering where Nick had come over. They played through my mind like puzzle pieces that suddenly fit together too perfectly. Was it that night last month when Megan said she was going out with her friends, and I didn't think twice? Or the time she spent hours texting, claiming it was work-related? There had to be signs. People don't just fall into bed with their husband's brother overnight. I thought about calling someone, but who? My parents would be devastated if they knew Nick had done this. My friends would either pity me or worse, offer advice I wasn't ready to hear. No, this was my mess to figure out, and right now I didn't even know where to start. Eventually, I forced myself out of the car and walked toward the park bench, hoping the fresh air might clear my head. Kids were playing on the swings, their laughter cutting through the chaos in my mind. It was strange, watching life go on like normal when mine had just been flipped upside down. I sat down, staring at the ground, as if the answers I needed would magically appear if I just waited long enough. But instead of answers, memories came rushing back. There was the time Nick helped me move into the house Megan and I bought together. He joked about how I'd finally settled down and left behind the bachelor life we used to share. Back then, I trusted him more than anyone. We weren't just brothers, we were best friends, or so I thought. Now even those good memories felt like knives digging deeper into my back. And Megan, I had loved her in a way that made me think she could never betray me. We weren't perfect, no marriages, but I had always believed we were solid. Sure, work had kept me busy the past few months, and maybe we'd fallen into routines that weren't exciting anymore. But wasn't that normal? Wasn't that just life? Apparently not. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. For a second, I thought about ignoring it, but something told me to check. It was Megan. Her name flashing across the screen made my stomach twist. I didn't answer. The buzzing stopped, only to start again a moment later. She was calling back. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to hear her lies, her excuses, her twisted version of how this was somehow my fault. Because that's what she'd do. I could already see it. The way her eyes would fill with tears, the way her voice would shake as she said things like, "It's not what you think," or "I didn't mean for this to happen." And maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to twist the blame back on me. That was the part that scared me the most. That she convinced me it was my fault. That I'd actually believe her. The phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. "David, please come home. We need to talk. I can explain everything." Explain? How do you explain sleeping with someone's brother? Was there a manual I missed on that? I threw the phone onto the bench next to me and leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow across the park. It reminded me of the evenings Megan and I used to spend on our porch, sipping wine and talking about our dreams. I hadn't thought about those evenings in a long time, probably because they'd stopped happening. When I opened my eyes, I saw someone approaching. Nick. Of course, he'd found me. He knew me well enough to guess where I'd go when I needed space. But this time, his presence felt like an invasion, not comfort. "David," he called out, slowing his steps as he got closer. "We need to talk." I stayed seated, staring at the ground as he came to a stop in front of me. His voice was calm, like he thought he could reason his way out of this. But there was no reasoning, no justifying what he had done. "I don't think you understand how much damage you've caused," I said quietly, my voice steady but cold. "Whatever you're about to say, save it. I don't want to hear it." "I didn't mean," he began, but I cut him off. "You didn't mean to sleep with my wife?" I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Spare me, Nick. You meant it. You both did." He looked down at the ground, his hands shoved in his pockets like some guilty teenager caught stealing candy. But this wasn't some harmless mistake. This was betrayal on a level I hadn't even known existed until now. "I'm sorry," he said, barely above a whisper. "I wanted to hit him, to make him feel the kind of pain that was tearing me apart inside. But I didn't. Instead, I stood up, towering over him as I said the only thing I could think of. Sorry doesn't fix this, Nick. And it sure as hell doesn't fix what's left of this family. Without waiting for a response, I walked away, leaving him standing there, the weight of his betrayal hanging between us like a storm waiting to break. I drove home after leaving Nick at the park, my mind a whirlwind of half-formed thoughts and questions I didn't want to ask but couldn't ignore. Megan was waiting for me. I knew she would be. Her text messages had slowed down, but they hadn't stopped. Each new ding from my phone felt like a reminder of how much damage awaited me at home. When I pulled into the driveway, the house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. The lights were on in the living room, casting an eerie glow through the curtains. I sat in the car for a moment, debating whether I should even go inside. But I couldn't run from this forever. I walked in, shutting the door behind me a little harder than I meant to. Megan was standing near the kitchen island, her arms folded, looking like she hadn't moved since I left. Her eyes were red, makeup smudged around the edges. She had probably been crying, but I wasn't in the mood to care. "You came back," she said softly, as if she hadn't been sure I would. I didn't respond. I set my keys on the counter and leaned against it, keeping my distance. Silence hung between us, heavy and suffocating. The tension was so thick it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. "David, please say something," she whispered. "What do you want me to say, Megan? That I didn't see what I saw? That it's all just a bad dream, and we can wake up and pretend this never happened?" She winced at my words, but I didn't stop. The dam had finally broken, and everything I had been holding back poured out. "How long, Megan? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back with him?" Her lips trembled, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, twisting them together like she was trying to wring out the guilt. "A few months," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. I laughed, an ugly, hollow sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. "A few months? Wow, that's impressive. You managed to lie to me every day for months without breaking a sweat." "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, her eyes snapping up to meet mine. "I didn't plan for this to happen." "Oh, don't give me that," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You didn't trip and fall into bed with him by accident. This was a choice, Megan. You chose to do this." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a split second, I wondered if she was truly sorry or if this was just another performance. But before I could decide, her expression shifted, anger replacing the guilt. "You think this is all my fault?" She shot back, her voice rising. "You think I woke up one day and decided to ruin everything? Maybe you should take a good, hard look at yourself, David. You've been so distant lately, always working, always distracted." I felt invisible. I stared at her, the weight of her words hitting me like a punch to the gut. There was the blame. I had expected it, but hearing it still stung. "So this is my fault," I said slowly, as if I needed to hear the words out loud to believe them. "Because I worked to provide for us? Because I trusted you enough to think you wouldn't cheat on me while I was busy making sure we had a life worth living?" "I'm not saying it was right," she said, her voice softer now. "But things between us haven't been the same for a long time. And you know it." I shook my head, disgusted. "So instead of talking to me about it, you ran to my brother? The one person you knew would hurt me the most." Her silence was answer enough. I paced the room, trying to calm the storm inside me, but it was no use. The betrayal ran too deep, the wound too fresh. Every time I looked at her, I saw them together, tangled in sheets that used to belong to me. "David," she said, taking a step toward me, "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I cut her off, laughing bitterly. "You don't get to call it that. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk at the grocery store. What you did, that's something else entirely." She flinched, but I didn't care. I wasn't done. "Tell me something," I said, my voice steady now, almost cold. "Did you ever feel guilty while you were with him? Or did it only hit you after I walked in and caught you?" Her eyes filled with tears again, and she covered her face with her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know." I sighed, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to me. I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. Not tonight. There were too many questions, too much pain, and I wasn't ready to face all of it at once. I need time, I said, my voice distant. I can't be here right now. David, please, she begged, reaching for me, but I pulled away. I can't, I repeated, grabbing my keys from the counter. You wanted me to say something, and I did. Now I need to go before I say something we'll both regret. Without waiting for her response, I walked out the door and into the night. The cool air hit my face, but it didn't soothe the fire burning inside me. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove off, leaving behind the woman who had torn my world apart and the home that no longer felt like mine. I drove aimlessly for hours, the streetlights blurring into streaks of gold as the city passed me by. The radio hummed quietly in the background, some old song about heartbreak that made me want to rip the speakers out of the dashboard. I turned it off and let the silence take over. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, like the car itself was closing in on me. The images wouldn't leave my head. Megan's flushed skin, Nick's hands on her, the betrayal painted in such vivid detail that even blinking couldn't erase it. I couldn't stop thinking about the nights I had kissed her goodnight, completely unaware that she had already betrayed me. It made me sick. I pulled into a nearly empty parking lot near a late-night diner. The neon sign buzzed, casting an artificial glow over the cracked asphalt. I wasn't hungry, but I couldn't sit in the car any longer. I needed to be around strangers, people who didn't know me, who wouldn't ask questions or offer sympathy. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and the smell of coffee and greasy food hit me. A waitress behind the counter glanced up from wiping down the tables, her face kind but uninterested. I appreciated that. No small talk, no questions. I slid into a booth in the corner, my back to the wall. The waitress brought over a cup of coffee without me asking, and I gave her a nod of thanks. The warmth of the mug in my hands did little to calm me, but it was something to hold on to. As I stared into the dark liquid, my mind drifted back to Nick. Of all the people in the world, why him? Was it convenience? Familiarity? Or had they both been hiding something deeper all along, something that had been right in front of me, and I was too blind to see it? I thought about the way Nick had looked at me earlier, guilty, ashamed, but not surprised. That's what bothered me the most. He wasn't surprised. He knew this day would come, and he had been bracing for it. Meanwhile, I had been living in blissful ignorance, thinking I had a brother I could trust and a wife who loved me. I took a sip of the coffee, bitter and too hot, but I didn't care. The burn in my throat was a welcome distraction. I needed to focus on something other than the questions that kept clawing at my brain. When had it started? Why didn't I see it? And, perhaps the worst question of all, how much of it had been real? Megan's words echoed in my mind. Things haven't been the same for a long time. You know it. Had I known? Maybe, on some subconscious level, I had sensed the distance growing between us. But I had chalked it up to the demands of life, the way couples sometimes drift without meaning to. I never thought she would take that drift and turn it into a betrayal that cut me this deep. The door to the diner opened, and I instinctively glanced up. For a moment, I thought it was Nick again, showing up like some unwanted ghost. But it was just a man in a suit, probably on his way home from a late shift. My paranoia was getting the best of me. I leaned back in the booth, closing my eyes for a moment. The hum of the diner blended into the background, and for the first time since I walked in on them, I allowed myself to breathe. Not deeply, not freely, but just enough to stay grounded. What was I supposed to do now? Go home and pretend this was something we could fix? Leave and never look back? Confront them both until they were forced to face what they had done to me? The options spun in my head like a wheel, each one more exhausting than the last. I couldn't make a decision tonight. My emotions were too raw, my thoughts too scattered. But one thing was clear. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't ready to forget. As I finished my coffee, I thought about the years ahead of me, the life I had planned with Megan that was now nothing more than a cruel joke. And Nick, what happened to him? Would he apologize and expect me to move on? Or had he already written me off, thinking his actions could be justified somehow? I left a few bills on the table and walked back to my car, the cool night air wrapping around me like a second skin. The streets were quieter now, the world winding down while my mind refused to rest. I didn't know where I was going, but as I drove through the empty streets, I realized something. This wasn't just about Megan or Nick. This was about me, about how I had been blindsided by the people I trusted most. And that trust? It wasn't coming back anytime soon. Morning came too soon, though I hadn't slept at all. I spent the night parked on a back street near a row of closed shops, listening to the hum of the engine and watching the sky turn from black to gray. When the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, I decided it was time to face whatever mess awaited me. I wasn't sure if Megan would still be at the house, but part of me hoped she was. There were things that needed to be said, things I couldn't leave unsaid if I ever wanted any closure. I couldn't avoid her forever, and no amount of driving around in the dark would change what had happened. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was still there. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I stared at the front door, willing myself to get out. It took longer than it should have, but eventually I forced my feet to move. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath along with me. The smell of coffee wafted from the kitchen, and I followed it, my footsteps slow and heavy. Megan was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in front of her, her fingers wrapped around it like she was holding on for dear life. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes swollen and puffy from crying. "You're back," she said, her voice hoarse. "I never really left," I replied, my tone colder than I intended. "I just needed air." We stared at each other for a moment, the silence between us thick with everything we weren't saying. I could see the guilt in her eyes, but there was something else too, something that made my skin crawl. She wasn't just sorry, she was calculating. I could almost hear her mind working, trying to figure out the right words to say to make me stay. "David, we need to talk," she said, breaking the silence. I pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. "Then talk." She hesitated, as if she wasn't sure where to start. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I know you don't believe me, but it's the truth." I scoffed, leaning back in my chair. "Let me guess. It was an accident, right? Just like Nick said?" Her eyes darted to the side, and I knew she was scrambling. "It wasn't an accident, but it wasn't planned either. I was lonely, David. You were always working, always busy, and I felt like you didn't see me anymore. So you turned to my brother?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "Out of all the people in the world, you picked him?" Tears streamed down her face, but they did nothing to soften my anger. I had seen those tears before, when we argued about bills, when we lost a pregnancy early on, when life threw its usual curveballs. But this time, they felt like a manipulation tactic, not a genuine expression of remorse. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "It wasn't just about him. It was about what I wasn't getting from you." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "So this is my fault. Just say it. Blame me for your cheating, Megan, because that's exactly what you're doing." "I'm not," she started, but I cut her off. "Yes, you are," I said, pacing the kitchen. "You're making this about what I didn't do instead of what you chose to do. You had options. You could have talked to me. You could have walked away. But you didn't. You stayed and built this lie, and now you want me to take some of the blame." Her sobs grew louder, but I wasn't in the mood to comfort her. Not after what she had done. "Tell me something," I said, stopping to face her. "Was it worth it? Did he make you feel better? Did he give you what I couldn't?" She shook her head violently. "It wasn't like that, David. I never loved him. I never wanted him. It just happened." I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "It just happened. You keep saying that like it's supposed to make me feel better." She stood up, closing the distance between us. Her hand reached for mine, but I pulled away. "Please, David. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can." "There's no way anymore, Megan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You killed at the moment you brought him into our home." Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. My focus shifted, my mind working through the pieces of the puzzle that still didn't fit. Something about her explanation felt off. Too convenient. Too rehearsed. "How long has it really been going on?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Don't lie to me this time." She hesitated, and in that moment, I saw the truth flicker across her face. "A year," she admitted, "since the family barbecue last summer. A year. 12 months of lies, deception, and betrayal. All those nights, she came home late. All the time she said she was going to the gym or out with friends. It all made sense now. I was an idiot. I muttered, more to myself than to her. No, you weren't, she said, stepping closer again. You trusted me. That's not your fault. I let out a bitter laugh. Funny how you only say that now. But if I hadn't caught you, would you still be blaming me for everything wrong in your life? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. That was all the answer I needed. I can't do this, Megan, I said, turning toward the door. Not today. Maybe not ever. David, wait, she called after me, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my keys, opened the front door, and walked out without looking back. I didn't know where I was going this time, but it didn't matter. All I knew was that I needed distance. Distance from her, from the lies, and from the version of my life I'd spent years building, only to watch it crumble in an instant. I drove aimlessly again, but this time I didn't need hours to decide where to go. My anger wasn't finished yet, and there was one more person who needed to feel the full weight of what he had done. Nick, my brother, my blood, the man who had been there for me through every high and low of my life, until now. He had crossed the line, and I wasn't sure if there was any coming back from it. His apartment was across town, and I pulled into the parking lot just as the sun fully rose. I sat in the car for a moment, watching his window on the third floor. The curtains were drawn, but I could picture him inside, maybe pacing, maybe sitting there like nothing had happened. Either way, he was about to face me. I didn't bother knocking when I reached his door. I pounded on it, loud and relentless, until I heard him on the other side. The door opened a crack, and his face appeared, unshaven, tired and wary. He wasn't surprised to see me, and that only fueled my rage. We're doing this now, I said, pushing the door open and stepping inside. He didn't resist, but he didn't look happy about it either. David, I know you're angry, but... Angry, I repeated, laughing bitterly as I turned to face him. No, Nick. Angry was last night. Now, I'm something else. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I didn't want this to happen. Spare me that. I didn't want this speech, I snapped. I've heard it already, and it sounds just as pathetic coming from you as it did from her. He flinched, but I didn't care. I needed answers, and I wasn't leaving until I got them. How long? I asked, my voice low but dangerous. How long have you been screwing my wife behind my back? He hesitated, and for a second, I thought he was going to lie. But then he sighed again and said, a year. I clenched my fists, my body vibrating with the effort it took to keep from lunging at him. A year. I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. A year of lying to my face. A year of pretending to be my brother while you stabbed me in the back. It wasn't like that, he said quickly, like he was trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. We didn't plan for it to happen. It just... Stop, I said, my voice sharp. Don't you dare finish that sentence. I've heard enough of that excuse. He shifted uncomfortably, leaning against the wall like he was too tired to stand on his own. I know I messed up, okay? I know what I did was wrong. Wrong! I took a step closer, forcing him to look at me. Nick, this wasn't just wrong. This was betrayal. You betrayed your own brother. I wasn't thinking about you, he admitted, and the honesty in his words hit me harder than any lie ever could. I was selfish. I let things get out of control, and by the time I realized how bad it was too late. Too late, I echoed, shaking my head. You had a year to stop, a year to tell me the truth. But instead, you let me live in ignorance while you helped destroy my marriage. He didn't say anything, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of my heavy breathing. I trusted you, I said quietly, the weight of those words suffocating. You were supposed to be the one person I could always count on. I know, he whispered, his voice thick with guilt. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. No, you don't. I agreed, stepping back. But you're going to live with this. You're going to live with the fact that you broke something that can never be fixed. And you're going to live knowing that you're no longer my brother. His face crumpled, but I didn't stay to watch him break down. I had said what I needed to say, and any more would just be wasted breath. I turned and walked out of his apartment, slamming the door behind me. When I got back to the car, I sat there for a moment, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I had expected some kind of closure, but all I felt was emptiness. Confronting him hadn't made the betrayal hurt any less. If anything, it had only made it more real. I stared out the windshield, watching the world go by as people started their morning routines. For them, it was just another day. For me, it was the beginning of something I hadn't prepared for, a life without the two people I had trusted most. But trust wasn't coming back. Not now. Not ever. I didn't go back home after leaving Nick's apartment. The thought of facing Megan again, of walking into that house filled with memories that now felt like a mockery, was too much. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. One of those places with peeling wallpaper and a flickering neon sign that buzzed outside the window. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. And right now, quiet was what I needed. The first thing I did was shower. The hot water scalded my skin, but I didn't care. I scrubbed until I felt raw, as if I could wash away the betrayal clinging to me. But no amount of soap or steam could erase what I had seen, what I knew now. I stepped out of the shower, wrapped a towel around myself, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cheap carpet beneath my feet. I couldn't avoid reality forever, and I knew that. But for the first time in my life, I had no idea what to do next. My marriage was shattered. My relationship with Nick was destroyed. The life I had built, the future I had planned, it was all gone. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling me out of my thoughts. I didn't want to look at it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I saw Megan's name on the screen, my stomach twisted. I had ignored her texts and calls all morning, but this one was different. I'm leaving the house for a few days. I'll give you space. But please don't shut me out forever. We need to talk eventually. I tossed the phone back onto the bed, her words repeating in my head. We need to talk. I wasn't sure I had anything left to say to her, but I knew she was right about one thing. I couldn't ignore this forever. Eventually, decisions would have to be made. But not today. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the past 24 hours played like a movie in my head. No matter how much I tried to shut it off, the images came back. Megan in bed with Nick, the guilt on their faces when they saw me standing there. The way she had tried to blame me, as if I had pushed her into my brother's arms. My mind drifted to the last time Megan and I had been happy. Really happy. It had been months, maybe longer. I thought about the weekend getaway we took to the cabin by the lake. We'd spend hours sitting on the dock, talking about nothing and everything. Back then, I thought we had something unshakable. I thought we were partners in every sense of the word. I hadn't realized how far we drifted. I knew I wasn't perfect. I had made mistakes. I had gotten too caught up in work, too comfortable in the routine of life. But none of that justified what she did. And none of it excused the fact that Nick, the man I had trusted more than anyone, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. The knock on the door startled me. My heart pounded as I stood up, half expecting it to be Megan or Nick. But when I opened the door, it was just the motel manager, asking if I wanted room service. I declined and shut the door, locking it behind me. I couldn't keep hiding here forever. Eventually, I'd have to face the world again. But for now, I just needed time to think, to figure out what the next chapter of my life would look like. The thought of divorce felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. We had built a life together, a house, memories, plans for the future. And now I had to decide if I was ready to walk away from all of it. Part of me wanted to fight for what we had, to see if there was anything left worth saving. But the other part, the part that had seen her in bed with Nick, couldn't imagine ever trusting her again. And Nick? I didn't know if I'd ever be able to look him in the eye without feeling the sting of betrayal. He was supposed to be my brother, my best friend, but he had taken that trust and shattered it, leaving me to pick up the pieces. As the day wore on, I made a decision. Not a big one, not yet, but a small step toward taking control of the situation. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for a lawyer. I didn't know if I was ready to file for divorce, but I needed to know my options. I needed to be prepared. I made the call and scheduled an appointment for later that week. Just knowing I had taken that step made the weight on my chest feel a little lighter. By the time the sun set, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure what the future held. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. Megan and Nick had taken enough from me already. They had stolen my trust, my sense of stability, and the life I thought I knew. But they weren't going to take my future. I wasn't sure where that future would lead, but I was determined to find out. One step at a time. And with that thought, I lay back on the bed, closed my eyes, and let myself drift off to sleep, because for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed I could wake up and start again.